He was a man who couldn't stand oppression of others. He'd rather risk his life to save his people.
Tax agent.
Yeah. They're gonna take my hogs.
So after deserting the army during the Civil War and this tax master came for the farm of his kindred, he needed to do something.
What do we have here? It's quite normal you got there. 3 little girls for gone.
It's more like 8.
He wasn't afraid to speak the truth either.
How come you ain't up north fighting?
How come you ain't? Nah, don't do that.
They gonna shoot me?
Last time I checked, the gun don't care who's pulling the trigger.
We'll be back.
Welcome back to Flick Recap. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel. The story begins in October 1862, during the peak of the American Civil War. Confederate soldiers, bracing themselves, marched to confront Union forces. Despite the barrage of cannon fire and a relentless exchange of bullets, they pushed forward, leading to a gruesome battle. Many of the men died during this battle. Meanwhile, Newton Knight, serving as a medic for the Confederacy, transports the injured soldiers to safety and tends to the wounded. Witnessing the brutal reality of war firsthand, Newton becomes uncertain about life on the battlefield. While chatting with a fellow soldier, Newton learns that wealthy slave owners with 20 or more slaves are exempted from fighting and allowed to return home. This knowledge deepens his frustration, as he feels he is fighting someone else's war. One evening, while relieving himself, a teenage farm boy named Daniel, from Newton's hometown, appears before him, deeply afraid. Daniel explains that his family has been stripped of their possessions, and he has been forcibly brought into the army. He pleads with Newton to allow him to stay close during the next day's advance for a chance at survival. Newton, without hesitation, agrees. The following day, Newton and Daniel go into the battle together. Newton advises Daniel to follow only his instructions and ignore commands from other officers. When the fight got heated up, the two moved ahead of the charge and took cover in a trench. Suddenly, a group of Confederate soldiers arrives, with a sergeant ordering them to move. Newton was reluctant to move, but before they could act, Daniel was shot. Newton quickly carries Daniel to safety, assuring the young boy that he will survive. However, when they reach a makeshift hospital overwhelmed with casualties, they are ignored. Unable to find a doctor to treat him, Daniel eventually succumbs to his injuries. This leaves Newton even more devastated. Determined to honor Daniel, Newton deserts the Confederate army to return Daniel's body to his mother in Jones County for a proper burial. Newton arrives home carrying Daniel's remains on a mule. He consoled the mother and even arranged a funeral service for Daniel. Back on his farm, he reunites with his wife, Serena, and explains his sadness over the war and his reasons for deserting. Days later, he observes that Confederate forces have begun confiscating more properties, including livestock, as a form of taxation to support the war effort. When Newton's infant son falls ill, Newton decides to seek help at a nearby roadhouse. There, the owner of the place, Aunt Sally, refers him to Rachel, a skilled healer who happened to be a black woman. Rachel visits that night and helps take care of the child. Before she left the next morning, Newton expressed his gratitude by giving her a gold bracelet as payment for her services. The story then shifts briefly to 1947, where Newton's great-grandson, Davis, faces charges for marrying a white woman. The argument was that Davis, who is considered 1/8 black due to his lineage, cannot marry a white woman. So, his marriage violates the racial laws of Mississippi at the time. Returning to the 1860s, Newton visits a farm family whose livestock is about to be seized by Confederate officers. Knowing the family would not survive winter without their animals, Newton arms the mother and her 3 daughters with rifles and teaches them how to use them. When Lieutenant Barber and his cavalry arrive, Newton stages a bluff by placing sticks in the barn to create the illusion of more defenders. The strategy works, and the officers leave, vowing to return. Later on, Confederate soldiers and their hounds track Newton to his property. As he tries to escape, the soldiers release their dogs and he is bitten by one of the dogs. Eventually, Newton kills the dog with a knife and flees to seek refuge with Aunt Sally. She introduces him to George, one of her slave workers, and he leads Newton to a swamp. There, Newton is met by Rachel, who introduces him to a group of runaway slaves led by Moses Washington, a man wearing a slave collar. After a brief interaction, Moses treats Newton's wounded leg. Meanwhile in town, wanted posters for Newton appear throughout the area, marking him as a fugitive. With mounting pressure, Serena decides to leave the farm with their child. Back in court, this separation eventually weakens Davis's defense, as it proves Newton's relationship with Serena had ended before he fathered any additional children. In the meantime, Newton grows close to Moses and the other runaways, gradually developing a deep bond with them. He helps Moses remove his metal slave collar and supports their efforts to resist capture. With Newton's guidance, George delivers some weapons, and the group prepares to defend themselves against slave catchers. Meanwhile, Rachel continues to visit Newton regularly, and he teaches her to read and shoot. By July 1863, Vicksburg fell to Union forces, leading to a surge in Confederate deserters. Many of them, including Newton's former comrades, find their way to the swamp and join Newton's group. Together, they form a community, harvesting grain, building shelters, and organizing a militia to resist Confederate oppression. Months later, Lieutenant Barber, returning from a supply run, is ambushed by Newton and his men. The lieutenant reports the incident to Captain Hood, describing the group as the freemen of Jones County. However, the captain dismisses the threat, considering them mere deserters. Meanwhile, Newton's community strengthens its resolve. They take advantage of the rising discontent among locals, recruiting more members for their cause. As Confederate forces continue to raid supplies, they discover a hidden stash of corn in the house of one of the townsmen. But after looting the stash, they are intercepted by Newton's men. With more than 100 fighters, Newton's group corners the Confederates in the woods and retrieves the stolen corn, and also humiliates the soldiers before allowing them to leave. In the meantime, the freemen of Jones County celebrate a successful raid, cooking a hog openly and confident in their strength and the swamp's natural defenses. With their numbers and strategic advantage, they feel secure against any Confederate attack. Meanwhile, Captain Hood visits Aunt Sally's shop, urging her to convince Newton to disband his militia in exchange for a pardon. He warns that failure to comply will result in public hangings. When his efforts fail, Confederate soldiers resort to burning barns and offering amnesty to those who surrender their weapons. Newton, determined to resist, rallies his men to prepare for battle. However, Ward, one of the men in the woods with Newton, eventually grows weary of their ways, and he also persuades another deserter and 2 young boys to surrender. When the lieutenant arranges the surrender, Captain Hood, seeing their small numbers, orders them to be hanged. Before their funeral, Newton stirs the emotions of the gathered crowd, urging them to rise and fight back. The militia strikes, with Moses and others emerging from coffins to ambush Confederate soldiers during the funeral service of the men. A fierce shootout ensues, leaving many soldiers dead. Captain Hood, wounded, seeks refuge in the chapel nearby. Newton follows, corners him under a bench, and fires warning shots before strangling Hood and dragging his body outside. A year later, the militia has grown and they take the fight directly to the Confederate forces, ultimately defeating them. They lowered the Confederate flag and replaced it with the American flag, celebrating their victory. Newton leads Rachel to a private room in her former master's house, where she is to stay. Rachel is overcome with emotion and cries while recalling what she had endured during her slave years. Meanwhile, Colonel Lowry and his troops march to Ellisville, planning to dispatch a regiment against the militia. After receiving the news, Newton gathers his people and delivers a speech, reading from a document that outlines the principles of the Free State of Jones. In the end, some of the men decided to find a better life elsewhere, and Newton and the remaining men returned to the swamps since they were not equipped enough to fight the advancing soldiers. The militia eventually holds out until the war ends, building a thriving community in the woods. After the end of the war and declaration of freedom, Moses reunites with his wife and child. However, they soon found out that the government's promise of 40 acres and a mule for freedmen was revoked. Despite this setback, their new settlement town prospers, and a school is established where Rachel teaches reading. Months later, Serena returns to Jones County with her son, recounting how her barns were burned after she left. Newton, now living with Rachel, invites Serena to stay nearby. Sometime later, they are raided and Moses' son is kidnapped by slave owners. He sets out on his own to rescue him, but Newton intervenes, warning him of the danger if he goes alone. In the end, they made arrangements on how to steal the boy back from the plantation. Although slavery was officially abolished at the time, freedmen are still being exploited in the fields. Moses eventually retrieves his son with the help of Newton, but they are ambushed by armed slavers. Newton is charged and brought for persecution for his actions. He denies the charges and, angered by how the rules were bent, agrees to pay $70 to secure the boy's freedom. Several months later, Rachel gives birth to a boy and Serena, still living close to them, helps her take care of the baby. Back in the courtroom years later, Davis continues to face scrutiny over whether he descends from Rachel or Serena. However, Newton's family Bible, which documents Rachel's childbirth, provides evidence supporting the prosecution. Meanwhile, Moses works to rally freedmen to vote, encouraging them to stand together for their future. However, as he returned home, a group of angry white men followed him. The next morning when Moses was discovered missing, Newton searches for him only to find Moses' body lynched and humiliated. The community deeply mourned his death. On election day, Newton and his people marched to vote, demanding Republican tickets. Initially hesitant, the racist officials eventually allowed them when Newton and the others stood firm. Despite their efforts, the Democratic vote significantly outnumbers the Republican. Towards the end of the movie, we are told that as Union troops withdrew, Klan activity escalated, and thousands of African Americans were killed leading up to the 1876 election. Rachel, fearing for herself and her child's safety, grows increasingly concerned about their circumstances. She persuades Newton to relocate up north. Meanwhile, back in the modern court, Davis is granted bail on the condition that his marriage is annulled and he leaves Mississippi. He refuses, deeming the case illegal. The judge sentences him to 5 years in prison. However, to avoid federal complications, the Mississippi State Court overturns his conviction on appeal. The film then ends when we are told that Newton and Rachel were unable to legally marry due to racist laws in the state. Instead, Newton deeded her 160 acres of land, making her one of the few African American women in the country to own property at the time. If you enjoyed this recap, why don't you subscribe to the channel for more videos? Until next time.